Okay, lesson 10, moving on. We're going to cover really two different features that are kind of combined together in this lesson. They can be used independently of each other. Login enforcement and then violation detection. Two different features, we're going to explain them both. We're going to start off by talking about login enforcement, also known as login page enforcement. Think of a bank, your banking website. You must enter username and password on a login page before you can see any of the member benefits pages. You must do that. That's the idea here. So we have all these different pages on our website, our login page, our products page, my contact information, my orders, my profile, my balance, and so forth. The idea is I should go to my login page first, login.php. And when I do that successfully, I'm going to end up with a session cookie on my computer. And that's how web pages work, is now when I go to another page, like my orders page, it authenticates me using that session cookie. And that way, I can just go from page to page to page to page, and I don't have to put in my username and password again every single time. That would be terrible. So that's how typical web pages work, and that's how it's supposed to be done. But what if I have a malicious user that just goes directly to the balances page and they bypass the login page, and they're not really logged on as anybody, but they're seeing data here? Well, that's not good. We don't want that. So that is the threat here. People trying to access web pages without having gone through the login page first. And that's what we will fix with our login page enforcement feature. Now, we actually covered login pages yesterday when we talked about brute force protection. You may recall that in order to do brute force protection, ASM needs to know when somebody has successfully logged in or when somebody has failed to log in. Because when I fail to log in many times, it says, brute force. So we created a log-on page item, or I should say a log-on page element in ASM. Kind of the same idea here. Kind of the same idea. We're going to start, and this is how log-on page enforcement is going to work, so to speak. Now let's kind of think of the login page sort of being at the hierarchy above all of these pages. And you don't get through this, you don't get to these unless you go through this. So the user needs to log in successfully. They get their session cookie. That's good. They try to go to products. Session cookie authenticated them. They're good to go. But now, this malicious user, they're trying to go right to the balances page. But they haven't gone through here. They need to go through here when we're using login page enforcement, and they're going to be blocked at that point. So to set this up, this is kind of a review from yesterday. To set up a login page item, or a login page item, we need to know a couple of things. We need to know the URL of the login page. We need to know the names of these two fields, the username and password field, which we can find by looking at the source code of the page. We also need to identify something that displays on the page only upon a failed logon. So any of this text here really applies. That only comes up if somebody fails their login. And it's also important that we identify something on the page that only displays on a successful login, such as the word hello. That would never display if somebody put in the wrong username and password. So those are the four things we really need to create a login page element. The URL, the parameter names for username and password, and then text that will display on a failed login versus text that will display on a successful login. And we can then go in, and again, we did this yesterday, you did this in your exercise yesterday. We put in the login page URL, we put in the username and password names, the parameter names, and we put in text that will appear in a successful login, text that will appear if it's an unsuccessful login. We have to have the login page element to utilize login page enforcement. So this is really just step one. We'll get this login page done, boom, now we're good to go. So now we want to configure login page enforcement. So for that, we need to identify how many of these URLs, which of these URLs requires someone to go through the logon page. So for example, my products page, maybe I don't care. They don't need to log in first to go view all the products that are available. But to see my past orders or my own profile or my balance, I need those. So we're going to pick which of the different URLs need login page enforcement. We will then go to the application security sessions and logins. This is where you built your login page earlier. Now we have our login enforcement. And as I've said many times, this couldn't be any easier. Could not be any easier. All I need to do now is, and by the way, the expiration time, this is actually kind of a nice additional feature. You notice it's disabled by default. You can leave it disabled. But if you enable it, what that means is, even if they already logged in, they will eventually time out. Their login will time out. So if they logged in and then they left their computer and come back 5 minutes later and try to go to their balances page, that login page, successful login page, is going to no longer be successful. So I can enable that if I choose. And then I will just start entering in the different URLs. Now in this case, I guess I have chosen to add the products page. So I'm going to add the products PHP page, the balances page, the orders page. These are all different URLs. And in this case, I'm adding a wildcard. So anything in the customers slash, so this particular entry there, that would apply to any of those URLs. And that's it. That's it. You click on Apply Policy, and now we have login page enforcement. So the second item we talked about, like I said we're going to talk about for this lesson, is violation detection. So it's very easy for ASM to identify malicious activity. It can identify that I'm trying a SQL injection attack or a cross-site scripting attack, or I'm from a geolocation, anything that violates the security policy. ASM can block it. We already have that available. This is just taking it one step further. It's identifying a bad actor because they are submitting multiple violations over and over again. So for example, this malicious user, they just submitted some SQL injection attacks, a forceful browsing, some cross-site scripting, parameter tampering, and they're just continuing to do this. And so for each one of these, ASM has to identify it as a bad request, block it, whatever, tying up the ASM. Well, what we can do is we can identify that as a bad actor early on and then just block them completely from our web application for a period of time that we can choose. That's our violation detection feature. To do this, we need to identify this user. We need to identify that, the person who's submitting all these attacks. And we can identify this user in 4 different ways. We can identify them by the username they use to log in. We can identify them by their session ID, their web browser session ID, or a device ID. A device ID is a unique identifier that ASM creates every time somebody connects from a device. It creates a device ID. And we can also just identify them by their source IP address. These are 4 different ways that we can identify that as a bad actor, so to speak. So to use violation detection, now I can set some different thresholds for these 4 categories. I can say if there's any 20 violations by the same user, or any 20 violations from the same session, or any 30 violations from the same device ID, or any 60 from the same IP address, then I have found I will apply a mitigation. And we can select the mitigation. So in this case, maybe I've chosen to block them completely for a period of time, 10 minutes. So we apply 2 things. We apply the identification and then the mitigation. So now, once they've hit their threshold, 30 violations from that device, now at this point, just everything is going to be blocked immediately, no matter what they send, good or bad. They will just be immediately blocked. Good as well. So to set this up, we're going to use another item on this. So you notice we've been kind of using a few things on this same area, the login page list, the login enforcement. Now we have session tracking. So one of the first things we're going to do is we're going to enable this. This is what creates that device ID. So if I want to use device ID checking, I don't have to. But if I want to, I have to enable that feature there. This feature is really used for 2 things. It's used for this that we're covering, and then it's also used for cookie tampering, which we're going to cover in the next lesson. So this is what enables ASM to create this unique device ID for every device that's connecting, laptops, tablets, you name it. So we're going to first enable that. Then we're also going to do what's called session tracking, session awareness. What this is going to let us do is it's going to let us track a user based on something. What's interesting here is there's a few options here. You can actually utilize APM along with ASM. So if you're using an APM logon page, we can use that username. Or maybe we're using our own logon page. The logon page we just created up here a few moments ago. So now that's going to start letting us track and do things for that particular, for each user. So now we're going to start tracking users, and we can start doing thresholds based on users. So now we can do it based on device ID. We can do it based on user. Now at the bottom is where it all comes together. Whoops, I'm sorry, I'm going backwards. Here we go. The bottom is where it all comes together. This is where I now set up my violation detection. I'm going to enable it. Track violations and perform actions. We need to see more. Scroll down a little bit. First off, the violation detection period, that is the amount of time that we're tracking how many bad violations they've had. So if they hit one of our thresholds, we'll set up down here, within that period of time, they're a bad actor. They're a bad actor. So if we make that shorter, we're going to have more bad actors. If we make it longer, we'll have less bad actors. So the main tab you're going to use is the block all. This is used just to simply say, if I've identified you, you've reached a threshold, I'm blocking you. Blocking anything you do for a period of time. That's what we use the block all tab for. I can choose to block all URLs or any of the authenticated URLs that we configured earlier on this page. Remember that page there? So we can actually just block them from the pages that they got through from the login page. So this actually kind of works together with the login enforcement. But we're going to block all URLs. If they're a bad actor, we're blocking them completely. And then there's those 4 items we talked about earlier: username, session, device ID, source IP address. Each one we can either leave disabled or we can enable it. And if we enable it, then we can select what the threshold is. How many violations? Remembering that it's this many violations in this much time. And if they reach any of these 4 thresholds as a user or from their device or so forth, then what we're going to do to them is we're going to either block them indefinitely or for a period of time. And if we block them indefinitely, the only way they'll ever get back in is when an administrator unblocks them. So this is the main setup, is the block all. But let's say you don't really want to be that aggressive. You just want to see bad actors. You want to know who's the bad actors. That's what you can use the log all requests for. That basically is the same thing. We have thresholds, but at this point we're just going to be logging the fact that this user has now hit a threshold and they're still attacking us. And the delay blocking is a really interesting one. This is actually very interesting. It lets us have different settings for different violations. Let me just explain what I mean. So we still have our username, session, device ID, IP address thresholds. We can still set all that up. But the difference here is if you scroll down, these are all of the different violations: cross-site scripting, CSRF attack, data, you name it. Now we could move some of these, over, and these would only be the violations we're worrying about, so to speak. Gives a little bit more detail, I guess, minute detail. So once I've got this turned on, we have another report. Under our reports, we have our session tracking status. And on this page, you will see all items that are being either blocked or logged, depending upon which of those tabs we selected, and whether it's based on being a user, based on coming from a device, or IP address, or a session IP, a session ID. And of course you see the values, who the user is. That user got blocked, that's not good. The IP address they came from and so forth. And you'll see when the mitigation started and when it ends. And again, this has to do with how long they're going to be blocked. And remember, we may have left it indefinite. If we had left it indefinite, this is where we could select somebody and release them, let them back in. But that would be the only way somebody could get back in if we had left the mitigation as indefinite. So that is the login enforcement and then the violation detection. Again, really this is just one step above. We're already blocking these people. We're now just blocking them completely, identifying them as a bad source and just saying for a period of time, you're out of here. I don't care what you do. That's the additional feature. So in this exercise, we're going to create a new policy. We'll have no session tracking, no login page, no nothing. And you'll see that you can go from the login page without logging on. You'll see that you can send requests to all these pages without logging in successfully. And then you're going to add your login page enforcement, and you'll get blocked when you try to do it again. And then you're going to add violation detection by username. If you have time, you can then enable the violation detection by device ID. You need 45 minutes to work on that.